The Richest Man in Babylon. Okay, so I recently read this book as part of my bi-weekly book club, and I actually recorded originally the video with me and Ryan doing our review on it. However, unfortunately, I lost that video, or I wasn't recording it from the beginning at all, so I apologize for that. However, I'm going to do a quick review briefly, just so I can, well, why do I do any of these videos? It's just so I can recall what the hell this book was when I view it later on and what my thoughts were on it. However, it seems that a bunch of people have been watching these videos, so if they're getting dozens of views, I'm interested what other people are thinking as well. If you guys have read this book, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the description below. But I thought this book was okay to good. It basically is the story of building financial literacy in ancient Babylonia, which had a very unique economy, and that's something we'll talk about. But the book sort of has a foot in two different places, if that makes sense. It is basically trying to be a story about what it was like to be in Babylon, and then it's also telling a story about financial literacy, which can hopefully be useful today. And I think many of the lessons learned are ones that can transcend the time, as Ryan would say. So, for example, really the biggest quote of this entire book is where he says, "A part of all I earned was mine to keep." And so the idea there is that we have money that passes through our hands. And some of us have more or less money that passes through our hands. But ultimately, it's not how much money passes through our hands. It's how much do we retain at the end of an income and outcome transaction. So if you make $100 from your job and then $20 goes to food and $70 goes to something else, and then you've only got $10 left, well, that's the money that really matters. That money that's yours to keep, that's really the big question. And so I think we've also heard more of the contemporary phrase, which is you got to make your money work for you. That's really the prevailing wisdom of this book. And I think it goes about saying it a little bit slow, frankly. Even though this book is rather succinct, it's maybe about 3 hours on Audible, I did find that the pacing was a little bit slow. And I think it is trading a little bit of that speed for the sake of having a narrative with characters who you follow throughout the story, and who hopefully are going to make some of these lessons a little more memorable. So, for example, there was this king who had a son, and he had a lot of money. So he decided that he was only going to give his son a small amount of money, and he would send the son out into the world, determine whether or not the son was financially literate, whether or not he was responsible, and if he was, then he would give him the rest of his throne, basically, bequeath him the full kingdom. And so he sends this son out, and originally he squanders the money, but eventually he earns it back and then some. And so that proves that, yes, he can be the rightful king. And so little stories like that along the way. Then there's also a pretty serious subplot with respect to slavery. And so the Babylonians, based on what little I've learned from auxiliary research and also just what this book has told me, it does seem that there was a relative fluidity with respect to social class mobility in ancient Babylonia. So as I understand it, ancient Babylon was relatively pragmatic with respect to how they viewed slavery, something much closer to the encomienda system, or I wouldn't say encomienda system because that is seasonal, but it's something like indentured servitude versus chattel slavery, where you might be able to trade some of your time and manpower if you're in a debt or something like that. And that might be a little bit different than like you're born into slavery and you're property. Even though slaves were owned, it did seem that in ancient Babylon they had the right to vote, but they didn't have the right to hold office. So it's sort of like the status of like somebody who's maybe been bankrupt or something like that. Obviously a lot worse than that, but I just want to say it's not the traditional slavery. It seems to be a little bit different. And so there's a plot where basically he loses all his money, he goes into slavery, and then eventually he earns the income to buy himself back, which seemed to be a pretty frequent thing that would happen in ancient Babylon. And so it was interesting to get a little bit of that history as well, which I thought did hold merit and was interesting. One of the things I also thought about when I was reading this was, there's a lot of wisdom for things that I've noticed modern financial institutions have sort of legislated. So, for example, a big principle in this book is you need to save up some money for when you're too old to work. And so today we might call that a 401k, at least in the States, where basically, or some sort of, I think Social Security is something similar, where you're paying money for your future self. So I think that's all very interesting. One note was that I did think that the names were a little too long. I did find a difficulty, and of course the names are localized to that region. And as I said to Ryan, I don't want everybody to be named, Dick and Jane. However, I do feel that there probably could have been there's some devices in writing that we could use to have a shorthand for characters in order to be able to remind the reader of who they are a little bit. And so I did find that a little bit hard to follow, because sometimes they would be talking about somebody and I'd be like, who was that? And so I couldn't really remember. And that is also an inherent difficulty with an audiobook, where you are sort of just trying to keep it all in your mind. And I think it's a little bit easier to negotiate a complicated book when you're reading it in print. However, that was not the case for me. One of the other things I thought was interesting was they're pretty flexible with respect to money lending. The book is very open to this idea of you taking on debt, which I think and that's sort of I think a point of contention with modern financial literacy. So for example, Dave Ramsey, which is a pretty outspoken modern financial literacy advocate, he's very anti-debt, right? Because he realizes that's a big problem with people who are poor, who are not very financially literate, often get themselves into snafus associated with debt. However, there's also something to be said with people who do know how to harness debt, and they can, there is a power behind debt, and how do you leverage debt, and I think that's a whole different conversation. And so I think that's also something interesting that we might want to talk about if we dive into it further. But just to keep this brief, there's another element here, which is that what is the goal after all? So if you earn all this money, what is the goal? And so the book pretty succinctly states, hey, we think the goal is that you should be able to bask in contentment and basically just relax and enjoy the life you built. So that's a concept. I think there's also this concept, I think the modern wisdom is a little bit of like never settle. It's this idea that you're always on the grind. So maybe a pundit of that might be something like Graham Stephan, who's sort of a modern financial guy. So that kind of vibe is like this hustle culture, and like you're always on the grind. So I think that's maybe a different goal than it was thousands of years ago or whatever. And then it also reminds me of this short parable, which is The Mexican Fisherman and the American Businessman, which I highly recommend you read. It's very short and it's worth the read. But if you want me to spoil it, I'll spoil it. It goes something like this. The Mexican fisherman is fishing on the boat, and then the American businessman comes to him and he says, hey, why are you fishing on this boat? You're such a good fisherman. You could hire another fishing boat to do the fishing for you. And he says, well, why would I want to do that? And the American says to the Mexican, he says, well, if you hired another fishing boat, then you could move to New York City and you could have a fishing enterprise and you can sell stocks and people would invest, and then you'd have lots of money. And he said, well, why would I want to do that? And he said, well, if you had lots of money, you could, you'd live in this nice, beautiful apartment, and well, on the weekends, you could just go off to relax and get a little boat and catch some fish for fun. And then he's like, well, that's what I'm doing already. So it's sort of this idea of like, well, what's the goal anyway? And if you find a job you love, then maybe like you don't have to worry about it as much. But there's also this, I think, very serious time tick with respect to people are not going to be able to work when they're 70, And I don't know if they lived that long in ancient Babylonia, but it's just a concept of, okay, well, you're saving up for that, I guess. I don't know, just another element of the discussion, I suppose. And overall, I would say I would probably not recommend this book for financial literacy. There's probably a lot of other books out there, and I've certainly read a lot in this genre. And I would say that in terms of sort of like historical fiction, I wouldn't recommend this book either. I think in terms, this book is very much like a parable. I think something like The Alchemist is a close comparison for another book that might be in this genre. If you like that book, you probably will like this one. But in general, I would say it wasn't my favorite kind of book, and it's not my favorite kind within the genre. So I think in the process of sort of having two different feet, as I was saying, in different places, it has left itself on unstable ground, and it doesn't firmly plant a foot in either. So I would rate this book a 2 out of 5, and Ryan said the same. I'm interested to hear what Jackson said as well, to get some more perspectives on that. But at this time, I would not recommend this book. However, I did enjoy discussing it. Probably, as Ryan said, it's a little bit more fun to discuss this book and some of the topics adjacent than perhaps to have read it. Because while it was very short, I think it could have been even shorter. Thanks.